One of the main goals of the Speech House podcast is to help people improving their public speaking skills and as a result becoming better communicators and leaders. And I truly believe that leaders stand out in times of crisis. And today with our guest, Dr. Timothy Coombs, we are going to explore the world of crisis communication. Dr. Coombs is an international and renowned expert and author in the world of crisis communication. He's at the origin of the Situational Crisis Communication Theories and is the author of the award-winning book, Ongoing Crisis Communication, Planning, Managing, and Responding. He's also taught at many universities such as Texas A&M and is currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Contingencies and Crisis Management and also worked for the Center for Crisis and Risk Communication. Dr. Coombs, welcome to the Speech House podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, pleasure is mine. Before we dig into the world of crisis communication, I like to start with the way you got involved in the field. If I'm correct, you were assigned to read an assignment on gallows rhetorics, and I would like to know how you make the connections between the two.
Yeah, it's an odd story because I read these pieces and they're strange. It's like what people were saying right before they were executed, before they were hanged, and I thought, well, there are some companies at the time going through some really big high-profile crises, and that's sort of a similar situation. You've been found guilty, so what are you saying as you're about to be punished for what you've done in terms of the crisis? So how do you address that situation? So it started me thinking about crisis situations and how companies respond to those situations.
Interesting. And so when you go and work with the corporation, what is the first thing that you always do?
Well, for me, I'm going in. I'm usually there to help them get ready for a type of crisis. And the first thing I had them is to have them think about their risks. What are the risks you face as an organization? And it's good to have a lot of different people from management in the room because different parts of an organization experience different types of risks. And they need to start talking about them and really thinking about their risks. And very forward-thinking companies now will sort of have either quarterly or sometimes monthly meetings of their managers to talk about how the risk landscape has shifted. But I use that as a starting point because once you know your risks, you know the types of crises you have and what you need to do to prepare for those crises.
Yeah, that actually brings me to my next question. Are there different type of crises? And if so, what are they?
There are some very distinct different types of crises, and they have different impacts upon the organization and the stakeholders. In some cases, you have what we call the victim crises, where both the organization and their stakeholders are victims of some external factors. That might be a product tampering, which is rare, but it does occur. That can include sort of a terror attack, and it can also include natural disasters, where both the stakeholders and the organization suffer from that. And in those cases, those are fairly easy to handle because there's not a lot of responsibility placed on the organization. Then sometimes you have what are considered accidental crises. Things just happen sometimes. There are technical failures in your company. It could be equipment. It could be software. There's a glitch. There's a problem. It creates issues. Airlines see this a lot when they have technical glitches and they can't load people on planes. And again, they're not too hard to manage, although in the case of the airlines, you have some very angry customers to deal with. But it's, all right, here was what the problem is. We've resolved the problem. We've moved on. But it's when you get into those more sort of preventable types of crises where people think, you could have done something different. And this really has put your stakeholders at risk. And a lot of that includes management misconduct, managers purposely engaging in behavior that's either illegal or sort of immoral in some ways, but often irresponsible types of behaviors. And those are harder to recover from because you have a lot of responsibility and it creates a lot of negative emotions within your stakeholders. So those negative emotions make it harder to communicate in those situations.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your previous answer that the importance of having monthly meetings, and what do you think that some of the actions that could be for corporations and company in order to, like you said, to avoid those preventable crises?
For organizations, that's where you really need to be monitoring your risks and think about your risk very broadly. And what a lot of companies fail to realize is that ethics is a risk, the risk of unethical behavior. And organizations have been known to do ethical audits, but generally what the research finds is that managers don't want to talk about ethics. Even when they see someone else engaging in ethical behavior, they're very unlikely to say, oh, hey, what you're doing, that's wrong, and this is why it's wrong. And organizations, if they are more regularly sort of monitoring those risks, then they can start talking about them and create that climate within their organization where people can say, I don't think that's ethically appropriate. Let's think about a different course of action. So they need to really start bringing that out within their own organizations.
That's interesting. Yes, the link between ethics and how people can be afraid of it when actually facing it could prevent some definitely lack of crisis. And what I wanted to ask you, thinking about that, and what one of the things that we see a lot in crisis is the lack of transparency. Transparency is a big thing, and why do you think that when scandal happens, a lot of times one of the things that always come out is the lack of transparency, from the companies?
Yeah, there's a lack of transparency often leading up to the crisis where managers are hiding their inappropriate behavior. And part of that is the organizational climate. Are they willing to talk about these things? And it goes back to that earlier point. Are you going to talk about ethical behavior or not? And the more you talk about it, the more likely you are to catch it early and to prevent it. So there's a lack of transparency by managers trying to hide what they're doing. And then once it comes out, organizations too often fall back to the idea, well, we're not going to tell you much about it. We're going to handle this internally. It's not really for you to know about. And that's not the way to approach it, because your stakeholders do want to know about it. And not just people external, but your employees want to know about what's going on, what's been happening, and you're not transparent with your employees. And that clearly creates a problem in organizations when during a crisis, they're not communicating it fully to their employees. And part of that is oftentimes we call it, and probably a little bit unfairly, that's the legal response, because lawyers don't like to talk much, because the more you talk, the more that could impact your case going forward in the future. And so organizations, I think, kind of have a bad habit of thinking, yeah, this is a scandal, we'll just handle this internally and tell you the results. It's better if you talk about the process as you go along. It's more transparent, and you see that the organization really is working to change things. And again, like you said, you see this with scandals. There's a problem with management. Do they come out early and talk about what's going on and how they're handling it, or do they wait to some later date and kind of hide it a little bit? It's better to kind of talk sooner than later. And we have really good evidence from that in crisis management with this concept of stealing thunder, that it's better for an organization to be open and talk about their crises. But when you talk to managers, they're not really excited about doing that.
Yeah, so you actually answer my question, which was about if there is a degree of transparency that people should share, but you answer, sharing that actually explaining the process might be helping to to gain the confidence of the public. And we've seen that a lot, especially with COVID, where there was a lot of mistrust from the public because people felt that governments were hiding things when perhaps they just didn't know. And I would like to have your take on that.
That's the case that during any type of risk event, particularly like COVID, the risk event that leads to these crises, you have uncertainty. And organizations aren't always good about saying, we don't know, we're not sure. And you need to be able to acknowledge that uncertainty, because organizations don't like to do that, because they like to have a sense of we are in control. So that there's a sense of power and control. And if you say you don't know, then that could be taken as a sign of weakness. Oh, they don't know what's going on. But sometimes you don't, and you have to be honest with your stakeholders about that. And many governments ran into that problem during COVID because they just didn't know. They didn't know much about the virus. They weren't even sure at the start really how it was transmitted, what this meant. And so as protocols changed, as we got more information, people are like, well, why are we changing? You told us
Mm.
to do this behavior. Now you're saying engage in this other behavior. And they weren't told the reasons why. And had there been more openness along the way, like, we don't know, we're going to try this, and that might change in the future, letting people know about the uncertainty, that probably would have led to better results in many cases.
Yeah, and we just saw, I think it was yesterday, where we found out that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, was actually let go by the board. It's just came out, and one of the things that I was reading was that the board had a problem with his lack of transparency. And but then it created a lot of chaos because so the CTO took over, but then the president also resigned, but we're not really sure if he resigned. And then Microsoft invested 13 billion. And in case like this, I don't want to put you on the spot, but in general, where you have big money and a lot of actors involved, who should speak first, and how should who should we protect, the stakeholders, the employees, because the employees found out on Google Meet. How would you handle a situation like this?
That's a case where your priority needs to be your employees, because this is largely an internal matter.
Yeah.
Now, there will be some issues with investors and so forth, but that's done more directly. You can have calls with investors, you can have meetings with investors. So you often, particularly your big investors, you're going to do that directly. But your employees need to know what's going on. If your employees are finding out through the media, that's a bad sign. Because employees resent that in a way. It's like, well, why are we finding out at the same time other people are finding out? Shouldn't we know more about what's going on and keeping people informed in the organization? And there's always been this sort of tension in organizations, and some people have thought, well, I don't want to tell employees because they might share information with other people. Well, they're going to. And that's a good thing, because if you look at things like the trust barometer by Edelman, people trust a regular employee from a company far more than they trust words coming from a CEO, whatever he or she might say. And so keep your employees informed. Let them be ambassadors for you. Most of your employees will. They identify with your company, they like being part of the company, and they will defend your company. So keep them informed. So they should know first. That doesn't mean that they need to know days in advance, but they should at least know minutes, if not a few hours in advance of what you're going to announce, because the research evidence is very clear that matters. And when you keep them informed, there's a greater sense of trust and a greater willingness to be with the company. Because when your company gets hit by a major crisis, that's when they're most vulnerable, and that's when people swoop in and try and take away your best talent, because they know that's a point at which people might be wrestling with their identity and working for the company. So I would say in a crisis like that, what we're dealing with right now, they have to be focused on the employees and then let that go out, move then to the outside world.
Yeah, definitely. And crises like this have always been like very hard to manage. But I feel that today, with the world we live in, with the world of virality, I mean, this news, I've seen already people commenting all over LinkedIn, although we have no idea really what's going on. And I would like to have you take on, the evolution of technology, and do you feel that it has changed the way we handle crisis communication? And if so, in what way?
I'd say the biggest way is it creates a greater pressure to communicate, and organizations have to be able to get their messages out quicker, because there's a building pressure on them because these messages get out in social media. And the example you're using is an excellent one. Here you've forced out a top officer. Well, that's huge news, and everyone's going to be talking about it. You should have been prepared ahead of time. One of the things that's recommended for organizations to have in a crisis is what's called a holding statement. And a holding statement is pretty simple. It just sort of acknowledges what's going on and that you're looking into it more and that you're going to provide updates. Very, very simple to do. And those are things that you should have in your crisis team all ready to go before any crisis hits. So if you think about your list of crises that are going to happen, you have them. Because oftentimes in an organization during a crisis, you have to have your messages cleared by legal.
Yeah.
You can pre-do that with your drafted messages there for your holding statements. Legal can already approve them. So when the crisis hits, you immediately send out the holding statement so that people know that you're aware of it and you're working on the situation. And there's no time lag, so you can save time in that way. And again, that's the pressure, because I always tell managers, I know the first criticism you're going to get is you didn't react fast enough. That's always going to be the case. No one ever thinks, wow, they were so fast. It's like, no, there's always a bit of a lag, because unlike in social media where people can go on and post and talk and say whatever they want, as a company, you can't do that. You have to be informed, and you have to have the necessary information to make your statements, and that's why holding statements are great, because you can throw those out immediately. You've already thought about them, so there's no thought in those, and then you can work on what other strategies you're going to craft and the information you need before you make those statements. So that pressure, I think, oftentimes creates almost unrealistic expectations for organizations.
Oh, yeah. And really, anticipation is key. And do you think that there are some channels that are preferable to share your message in such situations, or what do you think?
It depends on your organization and where your organization is active. If you're active on certain platforms, share them on those platforms.
Okay.
And what we see far too often is companies are very active, say, on Facebook, but they view it primarily as a way of marketing. So that when it comes time to talk about the crisis, they forget about that platform, and you don't see any information about the crisis on their Facebook page, which is kind of odd. You're in the middle of a crisis. I've seen cases where one time a company, in the middle of a recall of a product, they must have had it set ahead of time, launched a coupon for that product. It's like, whoa, that's a huge disconnect. Not only did you not mention your recall on Facebook, but you're offering a coupon for the very product you're recalling. Yeah, you need better coordination with that. Social media needs to be much more integrated into crisis communication, as some companies have done in the past.
So you advised against CEOs. You see that often, where, like you said, there's a pressure to comment, and sometimes you see perhaps not corporations, but celebrities who are involved in crisis, who would take over, and respond on Instagram. It's a big thing. Do you think that it's always the right thing to do because they feel like they can defend themselves, or should they be cautious about that?
They need to make sure that they're actually saying something factual and correct.
Okay.
Your biggest mistake is you jump out as a corporation or even as a celebrity and you want to immediately deny things aren't at all what they look like, when really there is something there and you're going to have to address it in the future. That's the biggest mistake you can make. If you just want to clarify and get your position out, this is what happened, this is what I believe, that's great, and it's a good way to do it on social media. We see many organizations now where CEOs, they do videos, and those appear. Those are very good if they're appropriately written, and
Yeah.
that they're the right tone. And what you want to do is you want to avoid any type of denial if you're at all possibly guilty, and you want to talk about, here's what the situation is, here's what our company is like, and here's what we believe, and here's what we're going to try and do in the future. And that's all fine. Those are legitimate things to talk about, because part of that is you saying, well, we know there could be a problem and we're going to try and fix it because unfortunately this is who we are right now, but this is not who we want to be, and this is how we're going to work to become better at what we do, whether you're a person or an organization.
Yeah, and I want to stay on the topic of social media, because I see that it's very different from reality, in the sense that if we are, and you often see people commenting and say, "Oh my gosh, all the hate on social media," but a lot of times, when you stopped being on social media, you realize that people are not as involved as it looked like. And you recently published a paper with your colleague Elina Tashova on how emotion can enhance crisis communication, theorizing about moral outrage.
Hmm.
And you mentioned the difference between anger and outrage.
Yeah.
And I would love you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, it's been fascinating work that Elena and I've done together, because it's moral outrage is different from anger. Anger is you're just mad because you're frustrated in some way, and what that usually means is there's some goal, something you want to achieve, and it gets blocked. And and that can be most customer service is angry. You want your product to perform in a way it didn't perform, so it blocked your goals, so you have problems. All right, so you're unhappy about it. Your flight didn't go. You're stuck in a city, so that's what it is. Moral outrage is different. Moral outrage is based upon you perceive that what happened not only is an injustice, but that it was intentionally done by the company, and it was motivated by greed, and greed in the general sense of trying to exploit people in some way. It could be financially, but it could be in other ways as well. And when you have those three factors together, it's intentional, there's some sense of injustice, and there's this notion that it was based on greed. That's when you have moral outrage. And moral outrage is the strongest predictor of wanting to punish somebody. And they've looked at this in psychology, they've looked at this in criminal science, that when there's moral outrage, you want punishment. And so you want to punish that organization, and it's what is called third-party punishment, that even if it didn't hurt you, you see what it did to other people, you still want to punish that company in some way. And one of the ways you can punish them is going on social media and engaging in negative word of mouth. So that's part of it. So companies are not buying, if you're a customer, not buying the product either permanently or just temporarily, to kind of show that you're what's going on through this moral outrage. And so that's why it's so different. That yes, anger can move you to action, but anger kind of comes up and drops very quickly. Moral outrage lingers for a while and is much more of a motivating force for people to take action than is anger.
It's very interesting how you explain those things, because a lot of time we just think that it happens, and that's why I wanted you to make the difference, because people seem angry and that's it, but like you said, moral outrage is very different, which brings me to my question. Like, you are the origin of the situational crisis communication theory, and why do you think it is important to integrate research and theory when dealing with crisis communication?
I think crisis communication, particularly the research part of it, evolved out of the practice. That people were out there doing crisis communication, and the researchers came along and said, "Oh, how can we improve upon this?" And the research that I do is primarily experimental, and what I'm trying to look at is I'm trying to prove a cause and effect relationship between certain factors like moral outrage and communication, how that impacts stakeholders and the process. And by understanding how these emotions are out there and how people with those emotions react to certain messages, we can create a better environment where both the organization and their stakeholders benefit from the communication. And that's where research comes in. Research helps explain why. Why should we do things a particular way during a crisis? Because that's what managers want to know. I mean, managers don't always say, what theory is that? They say, why? Why should we do that? And this is the why. The theory provides the why we need to be doing this.
Oh, okay. And we talked about corporations, and you mentioned also, like, sometimes when CEO film themselves to address crisis, and we see more and more the emergence of CEOs that are considered as stars, and I would like you to tell me, like, what do you think is okay, let me rephrase, because, for instance, if we take the FTX scandal, and then we saw how the CEO was really seen as this big star, and then when Sam Bankman-Fried was convicted, it actually threw a whole mistrust on the whole crypto industry. Do you think that entrepreneurs should communicate about their company, or how would you make the difference between the personal brand and the company communication?
That's a real challenge, because when you're talking about entrepreneurs especially, it is sort of about them. It's
Yeah.
about the personality. And again, you look at what happened with in Theranos, what happened, and she's now in prison as well. And a number of these sort of
True.
celebrity CEOs have then wound up
Exactly.
going to prison. So they build it around their personality, and that's always danger. And I'll go back to it goes back to really early work in sociology by Max Weber, the sociologist, who said, you organize around really one of three things. There's a charismatic leader, but sometimes it's just tradition that you use, like a monarchy, and sometimes it's a bureaucracy, which most organizations are. And I think with entrepreneurs, there's a heavy leaning on that charismatic element because they know that's what's going to help get them funding.
Yeah.
Help that there Elizabeth Holmes was able to attract a lot of money into it because she was charismatic, and people
Yes.
see like the leadership, like Steve Jobs when he was with Apple. So there is this sort of it's almost it's a cult that builds around them, the cult of personality. Not to I'm not using the song in that regards, but the concept of the cult of personality that occurs, and that's problematic because it becomes hard for an organization to transition over into a bureaucracy, which is what it needs to do. So it has to get away from that. But I think we're seeing now in social media, I think is one of the driving forces. There's more of an emphasis on the celebrity CEO, and there's more of this, mixing the brand, personal brand, and the company brand, which is fine if everything's going right and you have what's a celebrity CEO. But when your celebrity CEO has a huge failing and they become infamous, then your organization becomes infamous. And there's even a concept to measure organizational infamy. And that's when people hear your company's name and just think, oh, that's just a horrible place. I don't want anything. I don't want any association with them. I don't want to work there. I don't want to invest with them. I don't want to buy their product or service. So that's troubling. That's the downside of it. That when you link those two together, the personality and the brand of the CEO and the company's at a real risk if that celebrity CEO fails. And that's not uncommon to see because a lot of the stuff that enables an entrepreneur to be successful also enables them to engage in bad behavior that gets overlooked
Mm.
and over time catches up to them. As you can even go back to Uber and what happened there. There's a lot of celebrity CEOs that have sunk their company's brand because they think that, and we see the same thing going on with Tesla with issues with Musk.
Yeah. True. Yeah, with Twitter, if you talk about Elon Musk, right now I think there is a new CEO. Let me find the name. And actually, what's interesting is that you have the charismatic founder, not founder, but CEO and figure, and then you bring into a CEO who's supposed to be okay, the more calm face, but at the same time, what I was reading is that there is some conflict because you can't really erase Elon. I mean, it's like he's the face of X, so it's quite interesting. And what do you think? Oh, I forgot the name, but what do you think that she should do? Like, how do you have to take your space, or how should be the communication? Well, in those cases, when you have such a charismatic persona at the head of a company, and then you come into it, what should be the way to go?
I just don't think it works.
Yeah,
I think that's a horrible position to be in as a CEO because you have an owner who craves media attention. He seems to feed off of it, and that's never going to go away. So people are never really going to know who you are, except insiders within the industry are going to know
yeah,
you. It's very hard. That's why it's tough for companies to transition out of a very charismatic leader because when Jobs was with Apple, it was always going to be Jobs until once he passed away, then
yeah,
someone else. So you have Tim Cook, who's been very good at
yeah,
his job, not nearly as charismatic, but doesn't need to be. They don't all
yeah,
have to be that way. So I just think, as long as you have someone who craves the limelight and still wants it, they will always overshadow you. People need to be able to step away. 'Cause, an example of that is Branson. Branson was the face
mm,
of Virgin, but
yeah,
he stepped away. He retired. He wasn't seeking the limelight. He wasn't making comments all the time. And so he goes off into the sunset, and the new management team can then work. And I just don't think it works as long as your owner, founder, whoever it is still there and still very much associated with your brand and very active in the media.
Yeah, and I think Apple is a very good example, and because I think it's actually like you said, when Steve Jobs passed away, people say, okay, it's going to be the end of Apple, but the brand itself was also so strong that I felt like it's a good case of having a strong personal brand as a leader, but at the same time, the brand is so big that actually anyone who run Apple today, it will still work. So in that case, I think it was a very good way, and the transition was also very successful.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. In that case, the brand was very strong with Apple as well. Is people forget, while in the early days he was part of the creative team, by the end, he wasn't really the creative driving force in Apple anymore. He was the face of Apple, and the technology was still there. And so when he passed, the technology was still there, still evolving, and it had that powerful brand to go with it. And that really worked well for them. That's one of the examples of a case that worked out well because those two brands had been built together so well that one could still exist when the other half was gone.
Yeah, and so I work with entrepreneurs with their public speaking and leadership stuff. And one of the things that, and I come from sports, and one of the things I like to do is the analogy. I like to bring always sport analogy in my work. And when it comes to the communication of the C-suite, I like to see them, as a soccer team. Basically, the forward, but you also need the teammates to be very strong. So you have the CEO, but at the same time, the way I like to work with companies is to have a plan for the CEO, but also for the CTO, the CFO. So the whole C-suite actually can exist. Also works with the egos, and
Yeah.
and but I think it's also a smart move because we see a lot, like you said, a lot of those CEO celebrities. I think it's Elizabeth Holmes. I'm not sure her name for the
Yes.
Terranus thing.
Hmm.
All those people. Yeah, they're going to jail. So then what happens? And then the brand, the company close, and like you said, the employees are the ones affected. So I think like it's really important to also have all the important people from the company to communicate
Hmm.
even before it crashes, because it also helps the brand to be stronger at the same time. What would be like if you had to give an advice for entrepreneurs, like a starter pack to handle their crisis communication? Why would you tell them to really focus on?
I would say that the focus on thinking about who you need to be involved when there is a crisis, because different types of crises deal for different types of expertise. And why it's great to have the CEO there, that's not always who needs to be talking. Sometimes you might have to have someone who has a lot of background in what might be production, so they know how the production facility works. And so to think, and I like how you talk about teams for the C-suite. They need to think about teams when there's crisis communication, because you don't have just one spokesperson. You can have multiple spokespeople, particularly at the same meeting. You say, okay, so maybe the CEO, he or she leads it off, but also has other people that they might need to talk to. Like I said, it might be someone in production. If it's something that's on the technical side, you need someone on the technical side. If it's more related to human relations, well, your human resource person needs to be there to talk about what can they say, what can't they say, because sometimes there are legal constraints about what you can talk about if it's an internal event, such as a firing or a dismissal of someone, even a top person. There might be limits to what you can say or do, and that's when you want the people coming in with the expertise. So think about it that way. It always should be a team effort when you're managing a crisis. They shouldn't think that one person alone needs to or should be handling it all.
Okay, yeah, I agree. And so the show is about public speaking, and I think that you also did some competitive public speaking in high school and college. And how does this help you in your day to day job? And do you think that it's a good thing to be a good public speaker? And I will tell you why I'm asking this, because with the suspicious kind of vibe that is going around, sometimes when you're a good speaker, people tend to not trust you. So I don't know. I would like to have your opinion on that.
I think overall it's an asset. I think public speaking is a real important job skill, and people tend to undervalue that. Yes, I mean, I think in U.S., probably any U.S. university you go to, you're going to be required to take a public speaking class, and students are like, oh, well, what do I need this? Like, well, you got to talk about it's a job skill, because I've also spent time doing some training in corporations where I'm just teaching them basic public speaking. So I tell my students, well, you can get this now as part of your coursework, or you're going to be on the job and they're going to pay thousands of dollars to help train you and get your skills better up. And you talk to people, and people think, oh, we don't need it in engineering. Well, no, you really do. I spent 2 years teaching engineers public speaking in a very good engineering college, because their feedback was, oh, your people are really skilled, but they can't communicate, and they need to get their points across. And even I've talked to people within the military, and to get to the upper ranks in the military, you need to have good public speaking skills. And yeah, people can be a little scared off by it if you're too slick in terms of what you're doing. But if you come across really kind of as genuine, that you really care about people, and that comes across in how you talk and how you acknowledge your audience and so forth, I think they're more willing, they're more receptive to what you're saying. They can hear your ideas better. Because there's nothing worse than having someone who has a great message, but they are so bad at speaking, no one hears that message. That's really troubling. That's sad, because the message is the key, and the same way you can't have no message and great delivery. Well, then people walk away like, well, what was that all about? So your message and your delivery need to work together very 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 clearly. And I think it's helped me, because I've done presentations now, like all in various places around the world, and having that skill and being able to relate to your audience, and also learning how to both craft and then articulate your messages is critical. And public speaking teaches you that here is my message. How do I I'm trying to work to get my message across the best way that I can. And so you become better communicators, whether you're just trying to inform people or you're trying to persuade them in some way. You have a structure that your audience can follow, become involved in, and help you get your message across.
Wow. And like you said, you've been teaching and you've been traveling all over the world to do your work. And have you noticed huge cultural differences in terms of handling crisis, in terms regard where, different places you've been, or at the end of the day, it's always pretty much the same structure?
It's becoming much more similar. It used to be different, particularly when you were talking about in Asia. In part, there was that dealt with, to some degree, with the power distances within the cultures. The corporations had a freer hand, and they didn't have to worry so much about crises. A good example that was in Japan. They knew they wouldn't be questioned. When they did things. Well, that's not going to be the case anymore. And so you see a lot more interest in preparation, getting ready, and learning how to communicate within that. There are still going to be cultural differences in how you communicate your messages and what types of messages might resonate more with your audience. And that's what you need to know as the local people adapting it. But I think that the basic process of crisis management and how that translates into crisis communication really is viable across the world.
All right. Well, we're coming towards the end of the interview, and I would like to know what's next. Do you have any projects upcoming?
Yeah, we're still working on learning more about moral outrage and the best way to communicate when you're in a moral outrage crisis. And that is kind of centered around the notion of embracing the pain, which is not something that management wants to hear. Like, so what are we going to do? We're going to embrace our pain. Like, no, that's not what we do around here. It's like, yeah, that's probably what you're going to need to do. And been looking a lot more now at kind of AI and how AI can help with crisis communication. Particularly smaller organizations can use something like the free subscription to Chat GPT to really enhance their crisis communication plans and their messaging. They can do a lot pre-planning ahead of time through using that sort of system. It's really helpful. They can do things that probably would have been cost prohibitive in the past. Even you can give it parameters and it can actually help you develop a scenario so you can do tabletop exercises with your employees. So I mean, it's a very useful tool for crisis managers that are out there. And also interested in the way that both augmented reality and virtual reality are being integrated into training and how that's really going to improve crisis training in the future. And I'm part of this larger project that's actually global collaborators. We have people in Europe, US, Europe, and Asia, and we're trying to refine the notion of what readiness means for crisis communication.
Oh wow, so many great things for you, and definitely be following all those things. Dr. Coombs, thank you so much for your time and all those gems. Do you have a final thing to say or advice?
Just, no matter what size organization you're in, and no matter how good you are, you're probably going to encounter a crisis at some point in time. So do some work to prepare yourself for it, because the better prepared you are, the better it's going to turn out for both you and the stakeholders affected by the crisis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coombs.
Oh, well, thank you. It was a great discussion.